So yes, I'm back again this week, and this week we're going to do a bit on macroeconomics theme 1, theme 2 it should say, but it's year 1. And so in the agenda today, we're looking primarily at the measurements of the state of the economy, how we measure the state of the economy in terms particularly of GDP, unemployment, inflation, balance of payments, and then an introduction to the ADAS model. And essentially, I'm trying to ensure that you understand the requirements for the key concepts in theme 2, and particularly here, for those of you who've just come from business studies, for example, never taught economics before, there's a couple of terms which have slightly different meanings or used in a different way in economics rather than business. I'll just point those out. And then think about the understanding of the main measures of performance, and definitions here again are very, very important. I've talked about this before about precision. We also need to develop your students' confidence in data interpretation. It's extraordinary. A number of students have great difficulty with this. Now, you may have some maths students doing A-level maths, that they'll be fine on the whole. But you may have some students whose maths is not very good. And there you are going to have to help them in this. It's not too difficult, but they need help. And then introducing the basic ADS model and considering the factors influencing the components of AD. So first of all, on measuring the state of the economy. Now, one way in which you might want to start is putting up something like this. And I found this works quite well. You can do this once a week, once a month, more likely, go through a term. I'm sure you'll be able to offer all kinds of incentives to your students and introduce a bit of competition. But you can just give them, I've made these up, well, I haven't made them up, they are real data. And then you say, well, if that's the answer, what's the question? And I've kept silent for 10 seconds because I'm sure you all know the answers, but here are the answers in case you didn't know. And what I would say is you can use this in a whole variety of different bits of data. And what is really important is for them to get some understanding of the real world, particularly in this section. And theme 2 in the specification actually says students should have knowledge of the UK economy in the last 10 years. And when you come to theme 4, it's sort of the global economy over the last 40 years. But why I'm emphasizing that is that to get your students involved in understanding what is really going on in the economy is very important. And this is one way you might want to try and use it. You may have some more imaginative methods, but this is one way. Okay, so we're going to think about some of these concepts then. And when we're thinking about GDP, GNI, GNH, I think that there is not a requirement to have a detailed understanding of all the components of how GDP, GNI are calculated. They certainly do need to have a clear understanding of what these terms, how these are defined. And it's quite useful for them to know the difference between GDP, GNI. And I just mentioned here that when we think about GNI, it might include remittances. And so, for example, for some countries, that's really important where Indian nationals, say, living in Britain or wherever, are sending money back to India. And I came across a figure for this. In 2021, India received $89 billion worth of remittances, which were accounted for in their GNI figures. So it's quite for some countries, it's really significant. So you should be aware of that. And then gross national happiness is in the spec, which I'm going to just look at in more detail in a moment. But again, this is something that is becoming increasingly important, really, in the light of issues like mental health. And this next slide gives an idea of all the different elements that might be included in gross national happiness. And you'll notice that I'll pick out a couple of things. Mental well-being, quite important these days, and I'll come back to that in a bit later on. Health, quite important, contributing. And I think, a lot of people now are feeling less happy because they are so insecure about the NHS. And I'm sure this is similar across the country in different parts of the country, but you can no longer, where I live, phone up and get a GP appointment. You have to fill up some bureaucratic form that's rejected if you don't write down what your sex is or something like this. All this can be very frustrating, actually, affect your mental well-being as well as anything else. So it's quite important to see this. Environment, notice there, education, very important, of course, material well-being, etc., highlighted in the current cost of living crisis. So this is something which, I suspect will become increasingly important. Right, when we're thinking about economic growth, obviously it's measured by increase in real GDP, that's after discounting the impacts of inflation. And then potential growth. Again, you need to think about this in relation to things we've done already, like it would cause a rightward shift in the production possibility frontier, or something we haven't covered yet, long-run aggregate supply. But it's that idea of associated with this long-term increase in productive capacity. And you might have, through this element, through this whole talk today, I have put some things where you might ask your questions for students. So why is growth an objective? And there's a lot in the news about this now because of the state of the public finances, really, and the fact that public services are perhaps not as good as they might be because we've had very stagnant economic growth. And then the more value-laden, subjective question, but is important because this is something that can be the topic of essays and so on. Should economic growth be an objective for macro policy in terms of particularly when we're thinking about the impact on the environment? And then you might get them to go away and think about some things. I know they won't have done this yet, but what factors are limiting growth in the UK? See if they can do a bit of individual research outside the classroom, and what factors might contribute to growth in the future. Very interesting here. I mean, I know there's quite a bit of pessimism around, but I was looking at something the other day about artificial intelligence. Goldman Sachs reckon that generative AI could raise global GDP by 7% by 2030, I think it was. And PricewaterhouseCoopers reckon that UK GDP will be 10.3% higher by 2030. That's equivalent to 232 billion pounds as a result of AI. So this is a really interesting area. So although we've had all this several years of very limited economic growth, there are the prospects of economic growth picking up quite significantly. And one of the things you might want to get your students to do is a bit of research on is how it might impact productivity. Now, I've mentioned those two figures. They'll almost certainly be wrong, but it gives you some idea that independent groups of economists are considering that this may be an important feature in the future. Now, if we then think about one of the objectives of this little talk today is about interpreting data. So I put here, just because it's quite interesting, I picked out Ireland, and these are some growth figures for Ireland. And then again, to get, especially for students who aren't so good at maths and stats and so on, true or false, Ireland's growth rate was increasing between 2019 and 2021. Well, you can see that is actually true. It's gone up from 5.3% to 15.1%. What happened to the level of growth between 21 and 23? Now, a number of students will tell you that the level of output has gone down. Well, of course, as you will know, this is not the case. What's happened is it's increased, but at a slower rate. Increased, but at a slower rate. And you'll notice in the quantitative skills section, there is a thing about understand the difference between rates of growth, changes in rates of growth, and levels of data. So it's an important thing. And so in that bottom bit here, yes, you've got the rate of growth going down, but that still means the level is rising. So, and then other information, you would need to assess whether Irish living standards have increased. Now, this introduces a new term, and the concept of the standard of living is obviously much more subjective in the sense that it relates not just to incomes and so on, but also to quality of life. And there's a whole range of things there that might be relevant. Now, in the next slide, I've just looked at comparing living standards between countries. Now, a lot of the points are identical to the ones, or they can be used in assessing whether a country's living standards have changed over time, except the first one. Now, if you had to compare living standards between countries, then what you'll see in the data is they often use GDP at PPP. And all that means is they are trying to equalize the purchasing power of different currencies by eliminating price differences in price levels. So it's a technical way of trying to make equal or eliminate price differences so you can actually make valid comparisons of, say, GDP per capita between countries. Now, quite clearly, whether you're looking at comparing living standards between countries or just how they've changed within one country, the first thing you need to think about is GDP per capita. And I think what's happened in the UK is that if you look at the situation of that since 2015, GDP per capita has in fact risen, but between 2019 and 2023, GDP per capita has gone down. And there's quite a bit of talk about this recently on our latest GDP figures that showed we had a mild recession. And then some people point out, well, that's not the real thing that affects living standards, it's GDP per person. And so that's really important to think about that, especially in a country where, you know, our population has been increasing. Then you've got hours worked, income inequality. Now, I haven't put down in these last 2 points, you can think of a lot of other things. The quality of life. Yeah, one thing I haven't put down is how secure or safe people feel. What's the level of crime? Obviously, the things like their personal freedom, levels of corruption, and so on. But this is where it becomes a little bit more subjective, much more difficult to measure living standards when you've got a lot of these other factors that are not so easy to quantify. I mean, can you really quantify the quality of education or the quality of is very difficult. So that's another thing. It comes back to what I was saying before about getting your students to think critically about these issues, because this will really help them in evaluation. Okay, if we then think about another measure of performance, which is employment and unemployment. And again, the precise definitions are significant and important here. So employment rate, ratio of employed to the working age population. Now, unemployment rate. Now, unfortunately, the spec says measures of unemployment, the claimant count. Now, if you look on the second bit of the claim, the ONS now no longer regards this as a measure of unemployment. So obviously, when the spec is revised, this needs to be taken out. They still calculate it. But why is it useless as a measure of unemployment? Because a lot of people who may be unemployed are not eligible for job seekers allowance. So that's really important to understand. So you have to teach this since it's on the spec, but you've got to teach again your students to be very critical about this particular measure, and that's in fact the ONS says it, they no longer regard it as a measure at all. So what is the measure used is the ILO. Now this also has its own problems. You'll know what the definition is. But I've put there in bold, this measure is unreliable and the methodology is being revised. Now, one of the issues about it, just think about what it is, labour force survey. What happened during COVID, of course, was rather than face-to-face surveys, it's now all online. The participation rate in these surveys has fallen considerably, and the result of that is that few people, well, they can't get a proper measure of unemployment. So the ONS is undertaking a big change, and what they're trying to, and I think it's going to be in the autumn, that you'll suddenly see revised figures for unemployment, because it's going to be measured slightly differently. But again, really good for evaluative purposes. Now, another thing that's very topical and in the news is the inactivity rate. And I've given you a bit of data here from the ONS. Between October and December 2023, the UK inactivity rate was estimated at 21.9%. Again, quite useful to get data handling skills right, because it's actually 1.7 percentage points higher than it was before COVID. And the other thing in today's news, which I think came out yesterday, was we've got an enormous number of people, 1 in 20 young people who are inactive who were inactive in 2023. And in today's paper, there's a lot about this of quite a large proportion of youngsters. I think there are more youngsters in the 20 to 24 age group who are inactive than those in the age group 30 to 40, which is surprising. So this is a really important thing. You can be fairly sure government will try to give some incentive, shall we say, or deterrence to be inactive in the next week's budget. But this has been a factor that's contributed to our shortage of labour. So this is something you should really talk to your students about, and what is causing it. There's a lot of mental health issues, particularly in that younger age group, and health issues arising from COVID, long COVID, etc., etc. Health issues as well arising from the NHS. And, you know, I mean, I'll give you I think it's always good in teaching to tell stories and everything. But this is a story I heard last week from a friend of ours who now lives in Dorset. And his wife told us that he got a phone call from the GP surgery to say his blood test showed he had cancer. So the idea is, well, can I see a GP? Well, there's not one available for 10 days. Now, that is absolutely shocking, of course, but again, it helps you to understand, well, it's a contributory factor to inactivity. The number of people, for example, another example is people waiting for hip or knee replacements and are too much in pain to work. So this is where there's the interconnectivity between different aspects of the economy and indeed the subject. So quite important to look at those. Before I leave this, there was one other term that I should have put in really, and it's something you ought to teach your students, and that is about the idea, the concept of underemployment. So what does that mean? Well, that's all about people who are willing to work additional hours but can't get to the work. You know, they are, say they're working 20-hour week, they may be willing to work 30 hours, but the firm or whatever they're working for, they're unable to do that. And it also includes those who are unwillingly working in low-skilled and low-paid jobs. So they may have degrees, let's say, and they're in a job that requires no more than, say, a few GCSEs. So underemployment relates to this idea of people who would want to work more hours, but there's no opportunity, or who want a more highly skilled job, but again, there's no more opportunity. So do remember that term underemployment to teach that to your students, because that's again something that they need to know in this whole context. Now I've put here some questions for your students, and you might just like to look at these. I'll just keep quiet for a second. You can, there's no need to put them in chat box, but just have a think about how you'd answer each of these, and I'll put them up in the next slide. So I've just put a few points here. Does the increase in the number of people employed necessarily mean the number of unemployed people is falling? Well, of course it doesn't, because you could have an increase in net migration, or it could be down to a previous increase in the birth rate that has led to an increase in working age population, or it could mean that there are fewer people going into higher education. So again, these questions are important to get your students to think. And I keep talking to you about getting your students to think. This is where the term learners is not appropriate when you're teaching A-level economics. You want thinkers. And that should be the term that you should be talking about. You know, resist the term learners at all costs. I'll tell you just another little story about that. I always try to get my students to think. And when I was teaching in the state sector, and I know this is difficult in this day and age, but I used to try to take the opposite point of view from students. So, for example, if you had right-wing students, I'll take some left-wing views, or vice versa. And in this particular group, there were some with left-wing views, but they were outweighed by the majority with right-wing views. And so the day I announced I was going to leave the school, which was a state school, and work in the independent sector, this student said to me, "Mr. Brewer, I think you're an educational prostitute." I thought that was brilliant, actually. I replied to her that I said, yes, but I'm suffering from exploitation by the state. So I was left with no choice. That was also true. But anyway, why I'm saying that to you is it's important to get your students to think. And I think it's really good. A student did say that to me, actually. Anyway, claimant count. Well, we talked about that. The cost of unemployment. Think about opportunity cost. Don't forget opportunity cost in terms of the output lost, waste resources. The impact on the public finances, very important. The personal costs, all that is significant. Now, this last question should be question 4. I don't know why it's come out as 3. Sorry about that. How might an increase in immigration affect the labour market? Again, really interesting. This is a hugely interesting area. There's this kind of thing around, and I know this has been echoed by the current government that says, well, you know, we've got to cut unemployment and getting out of the EU was a good thing because we've had all this low-skilled labour coming into the country and that's driven down wages. Now, that may or may not be true. But I want to just give you a bit of a contrast. There's a Nobel Prize winner called David Card, and he wrote something I don't know, about 15 years ago. And he did some research about Cubans, 125,000 emigrating from Cuba to Miami. And that caused Miami's labour force population to rise by 7%. And what he found was, in fact, there was no significant change in the level of wages in Miami. So you then have to get your students to think about, well, why might that be the case? Why does it not, you know, it might look very simple in a simple supply and demand diagram, say, oh, yeah, increase in workforce wage level go down. But you've got to think about the wider implications of all my immigration. It may be these people are not only producing goods, they're earning money, they're spending money, etc., etc. But anyway, this is, again, something to ask your students, get them to think. Okay, thinking about inflation now as another measure of performance. And I've put here in the purple on the left-hand side, what are the key things? If you get a question on the CPI measure, for example, and this should say CPI measure, they've got to think about changes in average prices. There's a survey. There's weights being used, really, really important to understand the idea of weighting according to the relative importance of consumer expenditure. There's a survey of average pricing, and then a base year set with index number equal to 100. Again, for those students who are not so confident in maths, what you can say is it's just, the index numbers are just there to make data interpretation easy. So you start off with a base of 100. So you've got a lot of complex data and you reduce it down to an index number. It's then much easier to look at percentage point changes or percentage changes depending on where you're starting from. And on the right-hand side, therefore, I've just given you that sort of summary of that idea. And then I've put a few uses. There's loads of uses of index numbers, but they need to be confident about using these. Again, making sure your students understand these things. And these, again, questions you can give your students. So I put here 2018-19 prices fell. Well, of course, they didn't fall. They rose less quickly, so they rose at a slower rate. So, you know, this is the idea of getting them to understand that. Then the average price level was highest in 2022. Well, no, it wasn't. It was actually highest in 2023 because there will have still been an increase in prices, albeit at a slower rate in the price level. And then the rate of inflation increased by 4% between 2020 and 2021. No, it increased by 4 percentage points. And then there was deflation between 22 and 23. No, there wasn't. There was disinflation, and another important term that they need to understand, disinflation, inflation increasing at a slow rate. So again, really just encouraging you to build your students' confidence in data handling, and theme 2 provides an excellent opportunity for doing that. All right, get you to look at this for a moment. This is from, you can see the question, it's chart shows UK inflation as measured between CPI between 2011 and 2015. And you've got the black line is the CPI. Then the dotted line here is food and fuel. And then this middle line is other goods and services. So if you just notice where it's going from, going to. And then there was a mark scheme for this, which said, with reference to the data provided, explain the process of calculating the rate of inflation in the UK using CPI, refer to the concepts of weights. So do you see they can get 2 marks for identifying how inflation is measured. And think back to the earlier slide I gave you. Well, there's a definition there, but notice they're talking about basket of goods, survey of average prices, reference to base year, family household expenditure survey. So you can get any 2 marks. The analysis mark had to be in the context of weights, their significance, and then the application. I think if I just take you to the bottom point, for example, if they just are able to interpret that graph in some way and pick out a month and then say what the rate of inflation was in that month, they could pick up an application mark. And then the other ways of saying a bit more about, say, the household expenditure survey. Now, I'll just hold that in your mind for a moment, and then I'll just give you a look at this answer, and you can have a think about what mark you would give it. And so I'll just give you a minute or 2 to look at that. So in this particular answer, this candidate, I hope none of you would have given it full marks because it didn't get full marks. And the reason is really this, that first answer only got 2 out of 4 because he gets a knowledge marks for the explanation of how CPI is calculated, but there's no reference to weights and there's no reference to the data. So, and why I wanted to pick this out is because it's so frequent that students miss out on what is often a very easy application mark by ignoring one of the key things in the question where it's with reference to the data provided. So they are expected to use the information provided. And that means making some reference back to that chart that we saw at the beginning. So this would have just got 2 out of 4. And here's another one, and I'll just give you this to look at quickly. And again, just think yourselves, I won't ask you to put this in chat box, but just again, work it through yourselves, think about what mark you'll give it, and I'll give you the answer in a moment. So again, here you've got this idea, this candidate talks about regular surveys, is going to get a mark for that, account of the prices of items in the given economy's whatever it is, average basket of goods, and then changes in in relation to weights, well, that's it, an analysis mark. And then he goes on to explain that. And then he says that the changes in prices are calculated and adjusted and then compared to a base year. So there's another knowledge mark there, index number set equal to 100. Now that's all fine. But again, I hope you spotted what was missing, which was any reference to the chart, to the data provided. So this candidate clearly gets 2 knowledge marks, and he gets his analysis marks for the weight, for reference to weights, and he clearly understands that. But he gets no mark for application. So it's just to make that point to you again, to, in answering questions, these are easy marks that so many candidates often miss out on. Okay, then thinking about further measure, final measure of the state of the economy is current account of balance payments. And I know you may be using different texts and everything, but I've put in here what is basically the pink book covering Britain's balance payments, UK balance payments, and try to highlight the key things. So when we talk about the balance of trade, that is the addition of trading goods balance, trading services balance. And typically UK has had, deficit in trading goods, surplus in trade of services. And obviously at some point you're going to have to do this, obviously more likely in theme 4, but they need at this stage to understand what, trade balance trade means, etc. Then added to the balance trade are these other 2 things, what's called the primary income balance, which is essentially investment income and remittances, and I've given you their definition of that. And then secondary income balance, which is foreign aid, contributions to international organisations like the IMF, for example. And so to work out the current account, it needs all those elements, really. The trading goods balance, trade services, primary income, secondary income. So make sure, I would stick with that. That is really what's recommended to use. Won't go far wrong on that. Then again, I've put here, some questions for students. So I've given you the link here to the 2023 pink book, and they can identify, there's all kinds of charts and things in there, the trends in exports, imports, balance of trade, what factors might explain the trends, what's the possible relationship might there be between economic growth and current account, inflation and current account. Now, why I'm doing that, because ultimately, later on in this theme, they need to be thinking about how economic objectives might conflict. And so it's useful to them to start thinking, if real incomes are going up, then people might be importing more, so that might have an adverse effect on the current account. If inflation is going up, and again, really important, if our inflation rate is rising at a faster rate than that of our competitors, then that will cause our competitiveness to fall, exports likely to fall relative to imports, so deterioration in the current account. So again, it's getting them to think a bit about these things. And you can see very clearly here, there are relationships between what we're doing in theme 2 and what comes later on in theme 4. So we now come to the other bit, which is the ADAS model, just an introduction to this, to get you again to think a bit about the model that they need to use, not to get too hung up about it or too confused about it, I hope. Aggregate demand. Now, what I think is the really important point here is to make sure they are able to differentiate between macro aggregate demand and micro demand. Now, I don't know what happens in your schools. I expect it varies, but in some schools I know you might be the only teacher, so it's possibly easier to make this differentiation. In other schools, perhaps one teacher is delivering theme 2 while you're delivering theme 1. But what's really important to make sure between you that they get this distinction clear. So if they're saying paper 2, clearly macroeconomics, they've got to be using ADAS. They've got to be labeling their axes, price level or average price level, and real output or real GDP. It's no good them labeling it price and quantity. They will not get marks for those diagrams if they label them incorrectly in a macro question. So really important to emphasize that. And then the components of AD, which we'll look at in a moment, C plus I plus D. AD curve downward sloping from left to right, real balance effect. This is, if prices going up, aggregate demand goes down, international trade effect. Again, this goes back to competitiveness. Interest rates, higher price level leading to increased demand for money, higher interest rates, and a fall in C, and therefore AD. So these sort of changes in the price level, so any changes in the price level are going to cause movements along the aggregate demand curve. Now, when we then look at the factors influencing consumption, things that might shift the whole AD curve. What I think is really important here is to think about things like disposable income, real income. Now, this is a point you might introduce the concept of marginal propensity to consume, average propensity to consume. It's up to you. I haven't done it on this session. I thought we'd leave that to a future session. But that's a clearly really important thing. And we've heard a lot about this. Retail sales, I think in December, were very much lower than the previous year. Well, why? Because that very first point, many people's real disposable income had fallen with the high rate of inflation we'd experienced over the 12 months and increase in tax burden, etc., etc. Notice here, rents quite important because they've been rising very steeply, particularly in some big cities. Consumer confidence, really, really important. What do people think about the future? Because that affects, if they're worried about their job security, then obviously they might be less willing to spend now. And that links up with expected future income. Interest rate, again, can shift the whole AD curve because obviously it affects the ability of people to borrow money. They have to pay a higher interest rate on a loan. So therefore they may decide to just reduce consumption and the availability of credit. Now, the last one, again, is really significant. They need to understand this idea of wealth effects very clearly. And this is tied up with particularly house prices, maybe stocks and shares and so on. And the theory behind this is that if house prices are rising rapidly, people will feel wealthier. They may take out a second mortgage on their home. Therefore, they will be able to spend more. So again, make sure they understand that concept. There's often, you will have seen questions before about house prices and, what happens when house prices fall. And sometimes you get answers that just take one tiny segment of the market and say, oh, well, there'll be more demand for, there'll be more demand for goods and services, etc. Well, that might just affect first-time buyers, but generally speaking, when house prices fall, homeowners are going to feel a fall in their wealth and therefore maybe cut back consumption. Now, no, home ownership in this country is falling and has fallen, maybe not such a significant effect. In other countries like Germany, home ownership is much less than in this country because it's much more common to rent. So again, get your students to think critically if you're comparing this in relation to other countries. Then we come to investment, and a couple of things here. Total expenditure on capital stock, on new capital stock, gross investment, net investment plus depreciation. And I just want to make this clear, if you're in economics, when you're thinking about capital as a factor of production refers to any goods that can be used to make other goods. It's not used in the sort of money term that you might use it in business. And similarly, depreciation, I know you have all these different methods of accounting for depreciation in business. This is in economics, in a way, it's a bit more simplistic because there's an estimate for depreciation in the national income accounts. They don't need to know all the intricacies of how you account for depreciation as you do in business. Net investment, again, obviously you summarize that as gross investment minus depreciation. Now just have a think for a moment about other parts of the spec in which investment's relevant. Just if you can put a few ideas in chat box, just one idea, that'd be great. And I'll give you a few things in a moment. Somebody's written multiplier effect. Ian and Stanislav has written determinants of LRAS. Brilliant. That's fine. You might think about production possibility frontiers. Mentioned that a bit earlier in the session. You could think as well about productivity and growth. Its relevance in supply side policies. Its relevance when you're thinking about the rate of corporation tax. In terms of theme 4, strategies influencing growth and investment. So there's a lot of things here you might include. Now, okay, what factors influence investment? Now, again, you don't need to write this in chat box, but just have a think about it. This is something I made up some time ago. And first of all, I started off with grape, and then I thought, no, we need a few more factors. So I now call this little grape. It's a grappette. And each of these letters stands for something. And you might just in your mind have a quick think about what each of those might stand for in relation to influence and investment. So again, this is a bit of fun for your students to do. Some, if not all. Let me just run through. Now, I've put down here, government policy. Think about the USA, the Inflation Reduction Act. They're going to spend something like $500 billion over 10 years on green energy. And it also includes increasing government spending, tax brackets changing, etc. In the EU, there's going to be €1 trillion spent over the next 10 years, mainly on green energy. So really important. Government policy is very significant here. Rate of now this is something those who come from business background will be well familiar. Rate of interest relative to rate of return on investment. Accelerator, this is a bit unfair because it's not required in the specification, but you could give a simple explanation. If incomes are going up following an increase in investment, that leads to a further increase in consumption, which leads to a further increase in investment. Very simple explanation. What about level of profit? That might influence how much firms are willing to invest. Expectation, as Keynes called them, animal spirits. Technology now, referred just now to earlier on in the session about AI, and sometimes just the fact there is new technology encourages businesses to invest more. So the development of new technology by itself can just cause sudden increase in investment. Tax, exchange rate. Okay, so that's given you a few ideas on that. Government expenditure. Well, look, I won't get you to run through this now, but another area that you can explore links with other parts of the spec. And I've put here some on the right-hand side. So state of the economy. Think about how the automatic stabilizers that are relevant in booms and recessions. This is a theme 4 thing it goes on to, but it's useful to think about these things earlier on. Get your students familiar with making links between different parts of the spec. Population size, obviously linked to migration. We've got an aging population, and that's having all kinds of problems in relation to healthcare. No party is willing to say, as they logically should do, that triple lock is absolutely ridiculous in the current situation. But there you are. Because they're not willing to do that, that imposes a huge burden on public expenditure. Real incomes, again, link this to income elasticity of demand. Basically, demand for healthcare is income elastic. And it's very interesting to see how the demand for private healthcare has increased enormously in recent years, with, I was going to say, the demise of the NHS. I shouldn't put it so starkly, but anyway. Cost of servicing national debt, really important now, because that's gone up so much in the last year, will go up a lot more this year, because we've got a lot of debt maturing that is going to have to be financed, and therefore at a higher rate of interest than before. And then political priorities. And then the last element is exports minus imports. And I've just given you a brief summary of those things, what might affect the trade balance. Then we can think about aggregate supply. Short-run aggregate supply, the main point I want to make here is that you should just draw this as an upward sloping line. And if you're asked for a short-run aggregate supply curve, that's the way they should do it. And I've put here, as you're familiar with, the sort of things that might affect the short-run aggregate supply. I think here particularly about raw material and energy prices. Use topical things. Next week, who knows, might cut national insurance maybe for employees rather than employers. But anyway, if students are asked for a classical long-run aggregate supply curve, they should always draw it as a vertical line, and that's associated with a full employment level of real output. And again, you've got here the sort of things which in the long run might cause this to shift to the right or to the left. Notice significance of productivity again comes in here, and the things, of course, are all involved in education and training. The Keynesian, now people sometimes ask, well, if you just say, illustrate your answer with an ADAS diagram, I usually will say to students and to teachers as well, look, probably use the Keynesian one because it's so much easier for them to evaluate. So if, for example, you get a change in AD, well, it depends where you are. The impact on real output price level, it depends where you are on this aggregate supply curve. So if you're in the perfectly elastic bit, it's not going to have any effect on the price level. It will affect real output. If you're on the inelastic bit, it will only affect the price level. So it makes evaluation much easier. And then the equilibrium, of course, we've got price level, real output, usual thing. And I've just given an example here of the impact of a fall in productivity, fall in real wages. So if real wages go down, that's going to affect real income. So the whole AD curve shifts to the left. Fall in productivity is going to cause AS to shift to the left. And that's just to give you that idea. Now, I've just wanted to show you something else to finish up with. If I can find it on my, let's see for a moment where we got to. Right, okay. We're going to share this now, new share. Right. So, don't know whether any of you have seen this before. This is from the Open University about 12 years ago. David Mitchell does 60 seconds on 5 or 6 topics. And I'm just going to show you 1 minute of this, which is on inflation and unemployment and possibly the conflict between the two. Great little resource. I put the thing on the slide, the link on the slide. So I'll just play it for you now.
Number 3, the Phillips curve. Bill Phillips was a crocodile hunter and economist from New Zealand who spotted that when employment levels are high, wages rise faster. People have more money to spend, so prices go up and so does inflation. And likewise, when unemployment is high, the lack of money to spend means that inflation goes down. This became known as the Phillips curve. Governments even set policy by the curve, tolerating the inflation when they spent extra money creating jobs. But they forgot that the workers could also see the effects of the curve. So when unemployment went down, they expected inflation and demanded higher wages, causing unemployment to go back up, while inflation remained high, which is what happened in the 1970s, when both inflation and unemployment rose. Then in the 90s, unemployment dropped while inflation stayed low, which all rather took the bend out of Phillips's curve. But at least part of Phillips's troublesome trade-off lives on. When faster growth and full employment return, you can bet inflation will be along to spoil the party.
Okay, so you can see there are a whole range of different things: comparative advantage, impossible trinity, rational choice theory, the invisible hand. Anyway, paradox of thrift, which we might look at a different time. So I just stop sharing that, go back to the PowerPoint. Right, so that resource, the link for that is at the bottom there on YouTube. And just to summarize what we've been doing today and really pick this up. So need to have demonstrate an awareness of current economic policies and issues. So we'll really try to emphasize that to you today. That's a really important takeaway from today. Precise understanding of measures. So the definitions of, say, employment rate or inactivity are important, how they're calculated. Developing skills of interpretation of data. We've done quite a bit of that in relation to GDP, for example, and inflation. ADAS model, and not to be confused with the DS model of micro. Understanding the components of AD and an understanding the factors that influence AD and AS. And that summarizes what we've done. And then there's the usual things: find out more, go to Professional Development Academy. And then we've got the Pearson logo, which I'm sure you'd love to see. Anyway, look, I hope you found today useful. If you need to ask any questions, I'll be online for a bit longer, and you can either type them in the chat box or whatever. So, yeah. Now, in the chat box, Colin has put up the link for the materials. Sorry, somebody said, could I share the PP again? Let me just go. What happened there? Something went wrong. Let me just check the screen. Right, hope you can see that now. And I'll just take you back. That's a summary. That was a slide with the resource on. I hope, can you see that now? I hope somebody can. Just check the other questions. Another great session. Well, there you are. That's nice. Yeah. Yeah, well, please, yes, if you need to ask anything, please do so. As I say, I'll stay online for a bit. Oh, can you tell me if PPP is just converting GDP per capita in USD, or are we converting prices in the same ratio? I think it's in US dollars. Can you see the link? Somebody asked me about the link. If you go back in the chat box, Nasaka, it has very kindly shared you the link and about right towards the top. So in case you need access to the training materials, she's put there and she's provided the link there. So go back in the chat box towards the very top. Added it again at the very end. Thank you, Nasaka. That's very useful. enjoyed that and got something out of it. And if Pearson contract me to do some more, I will do some more.
Hi.
Can workers' remittance in any case be regarded as secondary income? I think they usually are, actually, yes.
Hi, can I
Yes,
ask you something? Yeah.
please do.
Okay, so PPP is like purchasing power parity. We are just converting the per capita GDP like into US dollars, or we are like comparing the prices of goods and services as well.
Usually the PPP is calculated in US dollars to try and equate price differences to eliminate those price differences between countries, so you could get a more accurate comparison. It's a fairly complicated thing. I think that the main thing is for your students to understand is it's just a means of making the comparison between,
like it's just the exchange rate. We should tell students it's just the exchange rate. We are converting it into US dollars only.
Yeah, that's right. Because the problem is your students will understand you can't just look at whatever it is, Swiss francs and US dollars and say, well, GDP in one. So you've got to convert it to a currency and so on.
But like the actual concept for PPP is like we are like converting the prices into the equal ratio, right?
Yeah.
Some prices are like in different countries in UK and US, there's a difference between prices.
Yes.
So we have to make it equal with the like the tariffs and transportation expenses will make both prices same, right?
Yeah, that's right. Yes.
Yeah. Thank you.
Hello.
Hello. No, oh, there's one new message. Oh, thank you. Right, okay.
Hi, Quentin.
Hello, Nasita.
Hi. So I was wondering, do I keep shall I stop the recording or just wait just in case?
I think so, because it looks as though nobody, I don't know how many people left in the room, but it looked to be as though most people have disappeared now. So
yeah, there's just a few left, which is all right.
So unless anyone is desperate to ask a question.
Because I think Claire was trying to say something. Yeah.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you now.
Yes.
Yeah, sorry.
I can't hear you now, Claire. Maybe type something in the box if you seem to be going in and out of sound.
Apologies.
It's gone quiet again, Claire. I really just picked up half a word here and there, so I'm not quite sure what's happening with your mic, but as I say, Claire, if you're still there, the best thing to do is type it in the meeting chat, unless I can hear you. Please can you send me the pack via email? I'm not sure we can do that. Can you not see the link which is further up the...
It's clear. It was really good.
Oh, it says the link does not work. Oh.
Oh. Really?
Good. Anyway,
My trust blocked it.
it was
Oh.
really
Okay, I think
helpful.
somebody had this problem
problem
before, Nasika.
I've got is the pack. I'm at a trust,
Yeah.
and they have literally 2% of the IT, and
Is it possible, Nasika, to email it to her?
Yeah.
I can't, when I click on the
Okay. No problem. What I'm gonna do, I'm gonna send it over to you. No problem. I've dropped down your email as well, so I'll send it over.
link, it just keeps on blocking me.
Hmm.
No, it's just, it's literally when I try all the links, it just does not work. It took me ages to even get the Zoom. That's a nightmare for me. But
No problem.
is somebody actually able to just email me the pack
Yeah.
directly? I'm happy
Claire?
to put my...
I've got your email in the chat box. I've seen it, so I will email it to you shortly.
Yeah, you're still breaking up, Claire. I don't know. Your trust must be very... Oh dear, problem.
I think she's gone as well.
Well, I think if you're able to, thank you for that. I think this is one of the things somebody else said before, and then they've found it somewhere on YouTube, I think. But it's something may have to look into, because I think a few schools, because their security is so tight, they're so worried about issues with IT that they put all kinds of locks on. And I mean, I do know a school actually lost all its data on its pupils because of some hack, you know, so this is the issue.
God. Yeah.
Something Pearson may need to look at, actually, how we communicate.
Can get that. No problem at all. I've noted it down, and I will let them know about this, so something can be put in place for the future. So all right.
Okay. Okay. Well, thanks for your help today.
No problem at all.
I think we probably have finished now, haven't we?
Yes, we have.